Atomic gigantification was a sweeping Japan nation when along came a dude with an ultra attitude, a Kamen rider who's the greatest kicker of Japan. And of all, man, life's too short now, baby, to not talk big now, baby.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Kaiju Conversation Live. I'm your host, Elijah, and I'm hoping that everything's coming through just fine. As we all know, for this show, StreamYard likes to smear their horrible, disastrous work and doesn't do a stellar job at making it run smoothly for me. But I think we've got it here. So I'm going to do one quick thing to prevent any such things as echoing. And we are going to get on with the show. We are a little late. I apologize, but it's worth it because tonight we have somebody on board. It's an October spooky special. Now, this guest may not be spooky, but he does have a tremendous background that might spook the regular person. Now, before I introduce this fellow, let me just tell you, he is Mr. Official Godzilla Writer. He is Mr. Poet and Knows It. He is growing up with Godzilla. He is the one and only Donny Winter.
Hello, everyone.
How's it going?
I am doing well. What a beautiful and heartwarming introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I would like to say that I actually rehearsed that and wrote it.
Oh, I doubt that you had to rehearse it. I'm sure it just came to you naturally.
It did. So we're here. Welcome to the show. This is your first time being on a Kaiju Conversation based content. I've been on your show once, and then I interviewed you for Kaiju Ramen / Kaiju United.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I am excited to be on the show. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm pretty stoked, and I see that my twin is in the chat.
Yes.
Oh my goodness! Hello, twin. I miss you.
We got Miss Kaiju Kim in the chat, and like I said, we did start a little late. Apologies, I had some engagements I had to fulfill before traveling to my studio, as I like to call it.
Podcasters are never late, Frodo Baggins. They arrive precisely when they mean to.
That's a great way to put it. That's how we're going to say it. It works. But yeah, so I mean, where do we even start, Donny? There's so many ways to start this conversation.
Well, I know, right? We're in a very unique time. I feel like 2024 has been a huge Godzilla year, right? And I recently had someone ask me, Donny, are you burnt out on Godzilla yet? Because a few people have had the criticism of, oh, could there be some oversaturation happening? And my response has been, no, give it all. This is a Thanksgiving table buffet of Godzilla right now, and I am gobbling it up.
Yeah, I'm kind of there with you. I remember when there wasn't anything. Godzilla was everybody, the stigma has always been everybody knows Godzilla. But nobody, only a specific amount of people knew Godzilla. And so now it's weird because you can walk into Target, you can walk into Walmart, you can walk into any hobby store, you can walk into Hobby Lobby, you can walk into virtually anywhere, and he's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was at Meijer the other day, just doing some shopping, and somebody saw my Godzilla shirt, and I think it was It was like my Heisei purple Godzilla shirt. It doesn't even have Godzilla like labeled on it, I don't think. But somebody was like, "Oh my god, your Godzilla shirt! I absolutely love it. Where did you get it?" And I was like, if this were the 2000s, like no, somebody would have looked at me being like, oh, "That nerd! Like, why do they got a Godzilla shirt?" So just like the, I don't know. I feel like Godzilla has broken through like a threshold over the past decade or so where I feel like he's just more celebrated and accepted more so than it used to be.
At my job today, 3 people were wearing Godzilla t-shirts.
Three people, okay.
One was somebody I work with, and then 2 customers. One of them was a cat Godzilla parody, kind of inspired by Japanese art. One of them was the HUF X Godzilla merch, and then one was it was a fan art of Godzilla 62. But I was like, there's no way that I'm here right now, and there's 3 people in the building who have worn Godzilla t-shirts today. It just baffles me.
I know, I feel like I have like a sixth sense for whenever there's like a Godzilla fan nearby. I'm just like, I can sense, I'm Mickey Sagusa basically. I can sense something approaching.
But see, if I approach them and I'm like, I love your shirt, and then like I could easily embarrass myself and nerd out a little too much.
You know, life is too short. No shame, right?
That's true. Life is too short to not talk big, they say. Oh, that was an awful joke, but hey.
I loved it.
So, Donny, you talked about how this year's been a tremendous year for Godzilla content. But I like to also look at this year in a different light. So this year has been tremendous for, it's going to sound a little egotistical here, but our friend group, the people that we talk to, the people we hang out around, the people who we interact with frequently, has been a great year. And it's very novel, you know, considering it is the 70th anniversary and whatnot too.
Absolutely. It's been very surreal, I would say, but I feel like, and I think the one thing that I really love about our little Kaiju cohort is that we're very supportive of one another, right? You know, with our like creative outlets, with our successes, and I mean, so many of them intersect with Godzilla, of course. So like, it's always good to have that support network.
It is, and you know, at the end of the day, one of the things I really appreciate is how, you know, as we all, you know, we joked about, you know, podcasters appear when they must, you know, but life is busy, you know. I think for a lot of us, life has become busier since we've started our various creative endeavors, and if it's a podcast or a YouTube show or writing or whatever the case may be, right? Life has gotten crazier since we've all really started really diving into these creative ventures. And it's really remarkable to see the care and the desire to keep those going, even in those crazier, more hectic times. And that's something I really appreciate about a lot of us, I'll say, is we don't let things stop us from doing what we love. And I think that's really, really important, just in a general sense, for people to think about from time to time.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I kind of have like this internalized philosophy of when I stop, I let the haters win. And that's why I refuse to, because there's always someone out there who's, you know, lurking around being like, oh, waiting for people to fail. Like, I think that's kind of something common we see. And I don't like, that could come from a variety of different places, insecurities, whatever, right? But I think that we need to kind of filter that stuff out when you think about it, and just hold steadfast to what we do. So no, that's, I think, the thing that keeps me motivated, because I mean, in conversation, as a writer, I have these conversations with people about their writing, right? Like, I'm so checked out of writing. I'm discouraged about what to do. I don't know what my next steps are, and I'm just like, as long as you're doing something, that matters, right? It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be, ready for the world to see necessarily. But as long as you are getting that fulfillment inside, then that should be an accomplishment.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is kind of important. Is I do fear that a lot of people, and I'm not talking about anybody in particular. I'm just kind of talking in the world of the artist, whatever that art you're making may be. Um, some people eventually get to a point where they're like, I don't know what to do, and they do stop,
Mhm.
and it's kind of discouraging, not discouraging, disappointing, because speaking from a personal standpoint, I have done, I've written reviews, I've written informative essays, I've written liner notes, I've written biographies for actors and actresses. Now I've done video essays, I've done introductions,
Mhm.
I've done a plethora of stuff. I've done short films, I've done fan films, I've done photography. But for me, I've always kind of looked at it as long as you're doing at least one thing a day to push yourself forward,
Mhm.
no matter what it is. Maybe one day all I do personally is I make a graphic. Maybe that's
Yeah.
all I do in a day. But that is time that I spent learning a software, looking like with a creative mind, creating something. It doesn't matter if it was big, if it was small, if it was important, if it was minute. It's still, it was a baby step at least in a
Yeah.
in the progression that I want to go in. And I think that's something some people kind of miss sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that you just made too. I mean, I'll give you an example. I do think that there is a time and place where sometimes people may need to scale back a bit or like recuperate. I am actually coming off from a year of, I call it my like little sabbatical year, where I took kind of a pretty large break from writing. I didn't take a break from writing entirely. I still did stuff, but from 2020 to 2022, I literally churned out 3 books of poetry, which in the grand scheme of things, that's a lot. And I took 2023 off for the most part, aside from the Godzilla 70th anniversary comic that I helped write on. But knowing that I was still able to kind of carve out space to do that during my off year, which ended up turning into a pretty big project in its own, like it felt good. Like I was like, okay, like even when I'm scaled back, I can still be productive and that can be meaningful, right?
Now, out of curiosity, Donnie, how does that work for you? Like that workflow and that, because I mean you've done more than just those books of poetry. You've done more than your comic book. You've done
Mm-hmm.
more than growing up with Godzilla. You have your day job.
Mm-hmm.
How does one as yourself do juggle all of that and work in that area that
Mm-hmm.
you operate in?
I mean, thank you for that question. I think that's a very thoughtful question because, I mean, for those of you who do not know, I'm an English professor. So, like, I teach writing for a living. That is a lot of what sustains my writing career and gives me the ability to do all the things that I do. But it's very reading and writing intensive as a career, right? So I have to really set aside and allocate time and energy for personal writing. So like usually, for example, I have to kind of create boundaries with myself where I say, "Oh, the workday ends at this time for me, I'm now focused on family time or creative time, right? And holding steadfast to that kind of creates a routine, and that helps me stay consistent, right? Does it always work? No. Like sometimes, I mean, as a teacher, work comes home with me all the time. And I thankfully have the privilege and luxury of having a schedule that I manage myself and I determine myself. But in my mind, it's an important decision to make too. Like in my mind, I have to be like, this is important stuff that deserves my attention. So as a result, I'm going to allocate time and effort to it. Once I started internalizing that, and once I stopped putting my creative outlets on the back burner, I noticed I was more productive. I was more proud of the content I was producing, and I just felt more fulfilled by it all, right? But we have to honor ourselves, and part of who we are is what we put out there creatively. So why not honor that, right?
Interesting. That is something that, you know, I think it's no secret for anybody who watches this show or listens to my podcast. I'm I'm never not moving. Um, Sometimes I wonder if I'm moving in my sleep and I don't even know it. I actually do know that I move in my sleep. I can confirm that. I never wake up in the same place that I fell asleep at. Um,
Are you saying you
but
like sleepwalk?
I have sleptwalk before. I have done that.
Oh.
I've talked in my sleep. I've talked about work in my sleep, apparently.
It even dominates your sleep.
I our mutual friend Danny DeMena, I made a joke recently that, like, because he works a lot too. He every day he works a tremendous amount. He works more than me. Which is a scary thought if you know how much I work. And I straight up told Danny, I was like, you know, maybe the reason we're friends is because we're both going to end up dead at a desk working.
No. No, because what we love here, Godzilla, our escape, right? That's going to keep us going. Godzilla will keep us going until the end of time.
You know, it's for me specifically, it's been a kind of crazy because Godzilla, instead of being the, you know, what I've worked up to doing, Godzilla was kind of the gateway for me to get into doing other things that I wanted to do. And I know you and I talked about it in your interview that we did all those many years ago. That was like 2 years ago.
Was it 2 years? It was season 2 of Growing Up with Godzilla, yeah.
And my interview with you was 22, and we're in 24 now. We have like not done any content in basically 2 years
Together like this. We've like
Yeah.
guest appeared on things together, like Kaiju Kim's charity stream, but we've not like sat down and had like a good old wholesome conversation like we did, right? No, I think that was such a good conversation though, but I think that's, I don't know. I really think that's why I really appreciate podcasting like this. It's because, or doing live shows, however you want to describe it. It just allows you to kind of pause for a moment and just to sit down and have a good conversation. I kind of view these as like sitting at a coffee shop with somebody and just chatting and getting to know them and learning like what enriches them, like why we love the things we love, like why not?
Yeah, and honestly, one thing I love is you, and this might sound egotistical, so I'm gonna admit that first. I love having raw conversations where, like, I have nothing scripted. I do have a piece of paper in front of me, but it's blank.
It is ready for the creative content to spill onto it.
It is. There are times during streams that, like, I have my pen with me, and I will, somebody will say something and I'll write it down because it's like I want to talk about that. That's something that I want to make sure we establish and really
Mhm.
dive into, because there's there's something special about having raw, unfiltered, legitimate conversations. And to a certain extent, at some points I feel like it's almost not even making content, it's just people can use it as content. The
Mhm.
actual content itself is not intended to be that. It's intended to be something more than just, oh, let's hop on the mic and talk. It's more of a legitimate conversation. And
Yeah.
stuff like that I have grown to really love and appreciate. I actually uh the engagement that I had prior to hopping on here, I actually, one of the last things that I ended with was, I was telling my friend, I was like, "Hey, if you want to tell me about a colored pencil breaking and how that annoyed you, I would love, I encourage you to have to message me to tell me that." Um because there is such a beauty about having legitimate, unfiltered, unthought through conversations that just kind of, they start and there is no end point. There is no planned ending. There is no, all right, we've talked about the movie. Now we can give our ratings or reviews and move on. Like, it is just whatever comes out of the mouth of the person talking. I think that's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the, I mean, especially when it comes to live things like this, I think that's one of the appeals for it. I mean, I do have a live podcast that I do, Restitching the Tapestry, where we talk about like socio-political events currently happening, and like that live component really makes the conversation unique, right? Because you're not kind of boxed in. Whereas with Growing Up with Godzilla, like I do try to keep that kind of, I don't want to necessarily say in a box, but I like to provide some sort of framework, mostly for the benefit of those who join me, because not everybody is super comfortable sitting down having a conversation like this, right? So they might need discussion questions or guiding points to kind of help keep the conversation going. Although I need them because I have the tendency of being long-winded. So the discussion questions save my life sometimes.
See, I'm very like, I can start a statement and I can rabbit hole very quickly into something completely different. Like, I sometimes do jump around um with my topics, just because I once I start talking, it's something that as time has gone on, I've just started to do it. It's more of,
Mhm.
I've trained myself. I've always viewed it as the air quotes, because I'm not the only host of Kaiju Conversation. Rex is easily as important as I am into the conversation, into the production, into what really gets discussed. He is the other half of the show, but I've always put this pressure on me because I love putting pressure on myself. Like, as an example, I was giving a friend a gift recently, and I was stressing out that, like, I got the wrong candy, I got the wrong stuff. I was like freaking out. And so when I finally gave them to my friend, I was like, did I get the right thing? Did I get the right chocolate? Is this the right item? Is it okay? And I was on the money, thank God. um but it was just like, I legitimately was like, I put pressure on myself to be perfect. And, perfection's never really achieved.
Mhm.
But if you strive for perfection, whatever you do get usually can be more rewarding if you look at it a certain way and not underplay it.
So that's a good point, and I want to add something to that. Being perfectionist, and I think we all can relate with this, and I'm orienting this in the context of being a creator, of being an artist, writer, podcaster, whatever you want to call it. Um, Being a perfectionist is primarily the thing that gets in our way and stops us from doing what we want to do, right? For a long, long time, I would say for probably 10 years, I sat on a collection of poems that gathered dust, because I was too afraid that it wasn't perfect. I was too afraid of disappointing people. And that kind of sabotaged me from actually gaining the enrichment that I would eventually get. And I think we do that to ourselves. Like, this perfectionist attitude kind of self-sabotages us from what we really find enrichment doing. So, in conclusion, don't do that. Don't do that.
See, it's weird because one of the so I'm very like adamant that I like when I do a project. I was recently shooting something for a upcoming Blu-ray, and it was scripted. I wrote the script, but I had not had time to like actually memorize what I had written. And so the filming process was rocky. And I like beat myself up. I was like about to cry because of how much I was like putting myself down.
Mm-hmm.
But to a certain extent, and I know that's a very rocky place to be because you don't want to do that too much because then you're going to put yourself into a very bad mental headspace.
Mm-hmm.
But I beat myself up, and then the final results ended up being what I wanted it to be. And
Yeah.
it ended up, I was able to say, look, it was rocky, it was rough, but I got to a point that I'm happy with.
Yeah.
And I can look at this and I can say I made that. It was rough, it was difficult, and I may have spent a lot more time trying to say a person's name than I should have, but
Mm-hmm.
I accomplished it nonetheless. And then there's sometimes that like I surprise myself with what I can turn out. There's been some times I've done some shots for a short film, and it ends up being like this amazing shot that like I never thought I could recreate from my head.
Yeah.
And those moments feed that fire of wanting to keep pushing myself and to keep aiming for perfection,
Mm-hmm.
expecting lesser, getting somewhere in between, being happy with it.
No, yeah, like I think sometimes we just have to like there's an article that I have my students read every semester. And it's called Shitty First Drafts by Anne Lamott. And I think once people start reading that, they start setting aside that anxiety, right? And it's not to say that every draft of something that we do is shitty, but it's saying don't be afraid of that shitty draft, right? Because what might be imperfect to you might be perfect to someone else, or it might be, and you don't know, how they may perceive it, right? I'll give you an example. So I shameless self-promotion, my second collection of poems, which I can see the title of the episode is inspired by it. So I loved that little juxtaposition there, Elijah. That was nice. But this collection of poems, I spent probably a year and a half writing. And with everything that I do, writing-wise, I like to infuse just a little dash or dollop of Godzilla into it, metaphorically speaking. So I agonized over trying to think of how I can appropriately weave Godzilla into this. And I did dozens of drafts of poems, etc. And I finally settled on something that worked. And it was a series of poems themed around the mad scientists from Godzilla films. Both Kaiju United and Kaiju Ramen have published a couple of them. So thank you, all of you out there, for doing that. It means a lot. But the fact that I almost gave up at it, and I was like, this is like, why am I trying to do this? I'm getting so frustrated with myself. It's not really turning out how I really felt like it should be. Once I sat that headspace aside and I just went for it without that baggage, the poems came out perfectly fine. And I was like, oh my God, like, what did I just do? Like, by what alchemy did this happen? And you know, I got in my own way. You know?
I love that. That's, you know, there's something about, honestly, this is probably my favorite part of the creative process is, and it's funny because you see this appear in a lot of stories, you know, just when you think I can't do it,
Mhm.
something clicks, you know, something pops into your head and you're like, wait a minute. Of
Yeah.
course,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, you know, it's funny because this happens a lot also when people are collaborating together, right? I've seen so many projects where people, especially projects in the Godzilla community, where people have tried to collaborate, but maybe something didn't work out correctly, and you know, it didn't just pan out, or maybe something fizzled out, right? And a lot of it has to do with people kind of getting in their own way regarding maybe they just don't feel like they're, you know, putting their entire being into something, or maybe they are too worried about putting something out there that the pressure of failure is too great. That can be very debilitating. That's so more shameless self-promotion. The Godzilla 70th anniversary comic, voila. So this was one of the first collaborative things I've done on this type of scale, right? And Matt Frank reached out to me to be like, "Hey Donny, do you want to write on this Godzilla comic with me?" And I was like, he didn't even finish answering the question. I was just like, "Yes, please let me do it." And I remember I had this moment when we were collaborating, because what would happen is that as he was writing the comic, and as he had the comic, like the script written already, as he was putting together the illustration panels, he would show me, and then I would see like the character that was featured in the comic story, and my goal was to write a poem that would reflect that character or develop that character. And I remember this was the first time that I was like not afraid to ask questions, because I was like, hey, like, context here, like, what is this character's perception, and how might I connect the character with the image with the poem, right? So it kind of became like this very engaging exchange that we would have, where we would just build upon everything, and I was able to appropriately apply the poem in the panel and allow it to develop the character. Because like, honestly, I've never written for a comic before, let alone never have I written a poem for a comic before. And for those of you unaware, this type of poetry is called ekphrastic poetry, where you are looking at something like, say, like an art piece, and then you are writing a poem that is inspired by or engages with it. So very much the poems that I wrote were ekphrastic poems. So I had to think about, like, how is this engaging in conversation with the art, and what would the audience take away from it? And once I started piecing all of that together, like, it became a very authentic experience where I wasn't afraid to ask questions. I knew that I was capable, and that this was my profession, let alone I would not have been sought out had it not been, right? So like, it felt very enriching, and it was a very pivotal point in my creative experience where I was like, hey, I'm no longer afraid to put stuff out there, because I know what I'm capable of, and I should be satisfied with that. Oh, Kaiju Kim just posted something.
Yes. Let me see.
At the
There we
beginning
go.
of the year, I literally lost sleep over a video project I was doing for someone. I ended up getting a bunch of compliments on it. Sometimes we surprise ourselves, right? I mean, case in point, like with the comment, like, Matt and I were fully aware that it was an experiment. Like, it's easier to do it something experimental in an anthology, right? As opposed to like a series or a one-off. But we were like, we don't know how poetry will be received, because like, it's very different. But lo and behold, like, I've received so many compliments, people like reviewing it, being like, this was really cool, this was really unique, like, it was very telling of the story, like, I really enjoyed it. So that made me realize, like, hey, there could be a place for poetry in the comic book world. Yeah.
That's true. I was going to ask you. Well, I was going to compliment you, and then I was going to ask you. So I could never write a Godzilla anything officially. I could not. I For me, it would take every ounce of my existence to produce something that's not even worth putting out.
Are you telling me you never wrote Godzilla fan fiction?
I've done a couple. By a couple, I mean I probably wrote. I did 2 fan films and I wrote a script for a third. I will forever complain that those are utter pieces of garbage.
Oh, I don't
And
believe that.
and I mean I'll straight up say this. I made them to not be Godzilla stories. I just incorporated Godzilla into them. But my
Mhm.
whole thing, this has been something that for me has been a struggle because this has been a conversation that I've had for the last 5 years in this fandom, talking to fellow fans, especially in the context of I do want to be a filmmaker. I am actually directing official works, not for Godzilla, but for other things.
Mhm.
Um, I'm I'll throw this out there. I can't talk about it because it's between
Top
me and the filmmaker, but I'm adapting a story to an English adaptation. Um,
Oh, that sounds
it's
interesting.
it's gonna be a fun project when it's done. I'm really excited. The only people that know about it is me, the filmmaker, and one other person. So it's like even the guy who is gonna be getting it and doing whatnot with it, he doesn't really know yet. It's gonna be a surprise. Um, and I left that vague enough that hopefully nobody knows what I'm talking about. um,
Still a mystery to me, but it sounds super interesting.
um, and I've so like that has been a conversation piece. That has been something I've been asked. Elijah, what would you do if you had the chance to direct a MonsterVerse movie? Elijah, what would you do if you had the chance to direct a Godzilla movie? And my answer has always been, I don't think I could. I have tried for years to come up with a story. And every time I come up with an idea, I throw it out because it's not good enough for Godzilla. It's not good enough. I'm never going to be good enough. In my
I think
mind,
you are classically too hard on yourself, Elijah. You always have been. You always have been. But no, interestingly, before the whole comic story in the Shadow of a God happened, I literally never thought. It was like I would write fan fiction. I have the poem here and there that has some metaphorical Godzilla connection, right? But I never really believed that I would get to work directly with the material. And I won't lie, at the beginning there was a lot of pressure. I was very intimidated by it. I mean, working with someone as iconic as Matt. I mean, we've known each other for years, but working with someone in that scale, it was very intimidating because it was okay, that perfectionist pressure, right, kind of got in the back of my mind, and I was just like, okay, am I going to set myself up for failure doing this? But then when I saw the journey from because I stumbled across a bunch of the old ancient Godzilla comic books that I used to write when I was a kid. And when I saw that trajectory, I was like, no, 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 no. I deserve this. I deserve this. Because I think that what we put into the franchises that we love, I feel like it eventually comes back to us. In a kind of you give or you get what you put out, or whatever kind of cliche mumbo jumbo you want to think about. But I really do believe that. And I think that anyone has the potential to engage with the material in that way. Even you do. You are very talented, filmmaking, commentating, artistically speaking. I think that it could happen, right?
I have done commentaries. I have done that, but that's for me, what it comes down to is my life has been, I mean, my whole life has, as we talked about in your growing up with Godzilla episode, my whole life changed when I watched Godzilla for the first time. You know, my life has never, without Godzilla, there is no Elijah Thomas. And that's kind of corny and maybe stupid to say,
I feel
but
the same way too. I feel the same way.
and so it's like, for me, I think it comes down to the whole perspective of how can I give back to the thing that made me adequately. And you know, I might be a little hard on myself.
A
But
little.
I might pressure myself every day to make sure I get everything that I've ever wanted to get done, and I never achieve that because I have so much to do. But I digress. If/when, I always like to say when, because you never know. You know, you can make it happen. But if we're being realistic, if/when an opportunity like that were to happen for me, I think it would be probably the hardest project that I will have ever done and will ever do, because I would need to basically contemplate my whole life and what like what I have done to get to this point, where I am going from this point, what it means to me. You know, there's a little bit of Godzilla inside all of us. One movie once said. It just there's so much there to unpack.
But the challenge and the unpacking is what makes it so enriching.
That is true.
Right? Because like I think we should celebrate our trajectory. We should celebrate like our our feats. We should celebrate our feats. But I think it can be intimidating to do that though.
Yeah.
Right? Because it does require a certain degree of vulnerability to do a lot of that level of self-reflection. That's honestly, that was one of the central premises of whatever growing up with Godzilla, because I really just wanted people to think more about why they're a Godzilla fan, right? Because whether we are aware of it or not, as Godzilla fans, we all have had entry points. We have all had these trajectories. We've all had various aspects of the franchise that's shaped us in a variety of different ways. Why do we think that is? How has it shaped us as people? And how have we used that to put something out into the world? And that doesn't have to be something creatively speaking. It could be like the representation that we embody every day, right? Case in point, I love the Kiryu duology. Those are two of my favorite Godzilla films in the entire franchise. What was one of the central themes of the Kiryu duology? Akane, self-actualization, self-acceptance, realizing that despite something difficult that happened to her, she was able to persevere and look beyond that and continue doing something good. That's something that I keep in the back of my mind as well. Like if I'm having one of those rough days and I'm like, I'm a trash person, like, you know, a lot of self-deprecation, I think about her. I'm like, you know what? That fictional character was not real, like obviously, but the messages that I gained when I was a teenager from that person, that fictional person, stayed with me. Like I internalized it. It kind of became part of my being. That's why I think fiction in general is so important, because it allows us to kind of escape, but also place ourselves in different situations in order to process the reality that we're living in.
That's a good way to look at it. That's a real good way to look at it. There's a couple things I want to touch on. I'm going to quickly catch up. Hello, Helmy. Hello.
Akno Goji 2001.
Please not a Zillafoot 2. Hey, you never know.
Uh,
I could bring the Zillafoot franchise back around. I would do that in a heartbeat. I would
Kaiju wants,
happily.
wants you to reveal all your secrets.
Maybe one day. Actually, that that comment's a good way to kind of finalize my thoughts on what you said, and then I do want to talk about one other thing you mentioned earlier that
Yeah.
I really appreciated. But talking about trajectories, if I can say the word without stuttering it, um, I often do look back 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I was making backyard Godzilla stop motion fan films, and I
Mhm.
was making lackluster slideshow YouTube videos. And now, one of the wildest things for me is now I literally wake up and I get messages saying, "Hey, we're doing Hoshi 35. You're going to do the bonus features for it, okay?" And it's like, "What?" I never thought that I would get to a point in my life where I am working on kaiju films. I've
Mm.
I've worked on I worked on Yuzo, and then I worked on War of the Ninja Monsters, and in between those I've done Liverleaf, and I'm doing Sharkdemic, and
Mhm.
spoiler alert, I'm doing Hoshi 35. Um but that right there, let's see, Yuzo, Liverleaf, Ninja Monsters, Sharkdemic. That's 5 movies I've worked on. That
Mhm.
and that's in 1 year. That's 1 year. That's not including there's another film that I got to work on that I'm not allowed to talk about. Um, but the moment I can talk about it, I'm going to because I think it's really fun. Um, I've worked on friend of the podcast, Gretton Conwell and Matthew Fields of Giant Monster BS. They did a short film called Dissectoid, and they reached out and said, "Hey, can you contribute to this?" And so I got to direct a segment for this short film, and it's going to be in film festivals. And
So, well, celebrating this for a second, like these really amazing opportunities, I don't think would have come about had you not done. Well, obviously, your talent stands on its own, but without the community engagement that you've done too, like that's such an important component, right? I mean, all the work that you did with Kaiju Ramen, the work that you are continuing to do with Kaiju United, like these groups, these institutions within our fandom that are promoting community, that are promoting content and creation, people see that. People see your name attached to these really cool things. And I think that's a very important message. And then so I didn't mean to cut you off, but it's an important message because how are people going to see what we do and what we're capable of if we don't put ourselves out there in the first place,
right,
right?
that jump, that jump is very important. Um, it's funny because I mean my jump with Yuzo, um, was literally I was like, "Hey, I've seen this movie. I attended the premiere. I've got footage for the premiere. I'd love to do an audio commentary for it." And then Ron liked what I did. And then he was like, "Hey, I've got another movie. Would you be able to do something for them?" I was like, "Sure." I had never seen it before. I didn't know anything about it. I was like, "Sure." So then I went and I bought the manga and I went tracking for a translated version of the manga, and then I like did a whole deep dive into a movie I never thought I would do a deep dive into.
Mm-hmm.
And then Ninja Monsters came about, and then Sharkdemic, and now Hoshi. And it is that snowball effect. But if it wasn't for the fact that I was like, "Hey, I would like to do something for this," that would have never happened.
You put
Um,
yourself out there.
and that's something that as I continue to work more in various fields, and I've been privileged to have some opportunities. Some I can talk about, some I can't talk about, some that never actually went through, some that have went through and have been announced and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy how this stuff can just happen out of nowhere.
Absolutely.
I I worked with Titanic Creations because my friend Michael messaged me and said, "Bro, they're looking for this. You got to help them." And I just so happened to have had a contact that I had made a few years prior, and
Networking.
it worked out. And now there is an officially licensed Youngity figure coming, and I never thought that was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's been it's really amazing. But there is one downside that I will talk about, and then this is going to transition us into one thing I really wanted to talk to you about. Um, with all of the networking and the putting yourself out there and the content creation, I do a monthly live stream where it's raw thoughts, raw feelings, raw discussions. I
Mm-hmm.
do a podcast where I try to, I mean, it's edited. It is 100% edited. There is a structure to it. But
Mm-hmm.
in that structure is the chaos of a raw conversation that we try to keep intact.
Yeah.
I do all these other things. I write, I commentate, I work on movies, and da 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 da. I've done all that. I've utilized my own experiences in various creative outlets. Eventually, it gets to a point where you're like, there's so much out there about you. It does create a bit of an issue of like, okay, for some people it's who is the real me and who is the fake me, the mask. A lot of people put on a mask when they're in front of
Mm-hmm.
a camera, when they're performing. That's something that I was starting to do back a couple years ago, and I was like, wait a minute, that's not what that's the wrong way to go about this. I shouldn't put on a mask,
Mm-hmm.
because when you do that, you lose some of that enjoyment, right?
How about instead of it being a mask, it's a filter?
Filter is a good way to look at it.
Because, well, okay, so I'm going to try to explain this the best way I can. So, like, as an LGBTQ plus person, we have to often, in vulnerable moments, code switch and apply these filters to ourselves to fit the occasion. And I think that more people do that than what we're willing to admit. Case in point, that's the theme of Feats of Alchemy. Another self-promotion for it. But what we're doing every day, socially speaking, whatever space that we're in, we are performing an alchemy by adjusting ourselves to the groups that we're in. And there was a point in time where I felt very insecure about that, where I was just like, ooh, this isn't me. This isn't me. But then I realized this is me. It's just me with a filter that I have created. Thus, though, it's still an extension of me. Right? And the people around you who really do care and know you will realize that.
That's a good way to look at it. I had never thought about that before.
Well, no, so it's funny because I had somebody once, they observed one of my classes and they were like, Donny, you like exude a dramatically different energy when you are speaking in front of people than you do when you were like gossip girling, like at a bar or a coffee shop. It's like, yes, that's a completely different setting. Like, I'm not going to be gossiping with my students like, oh, like, no, like I'm going to be carrying an air of authority because that's what I'm supposed to be doing. And we do that in so many different settings, right? In the content creation world, like, yes, I would say that we are our authentic selves, but in doing podcasts and live shows, we're also some form of entertainment. So we have to be engaging. We have to keep people's attention in this like wild world of social media, right? So I think that it begs the question of like, is our ability to create these filters just like a latent ability that we've just cultivated since social media emerged?
Getting a little philosophical there. That's I
Sorry.
love that. I
You know
love that.
me. You know me.
Well, that actually, I wanted to talk to you a bit about this. So, one of the things that I appreciate about your presence, the way you present yourself, is you don't hide what you think. When you have
Mhm.
an opinion, you speak it.
Yeah.
Um, that's something that I really admire. I do that.
Thank you.
Sometimes I come across as an a-hole. um, but
No.
it comes with that whole thought process. But you talked about your other podcast series,
Hmm.
um, where you do talk about issues in life, and how in another sense you also are a teacher, and a teacher, whether a teacher would like to admit it or not, they are a bit of a role model. They
Hmm.
are to a certain extent. I think students look at a teacher as like, so this is what a fully formed human is.
Hmm.
Um,
We'd like to think. Whether I
um,
feel like a fully functional human being, like that's a whole other conversation.
um, but how does somebody more so how do you approach being that authentic self with a
Hmm.
filter or without a filter, however, um how do you approach that in your day-to-day, in your content, and how you just present yourself in general?
And I think the first step was learning more about myself, like self acceptance, right? Like that's kind of like the basic aspect, but I mean it required a lot of work. A lot like I have been in therapy for a number of years. Like that's helped me do a lot of self reflection. And I think in many ways, those skills that I developed as a result has helped me become a better teacher, a better creator, a better friend, a better significant other, like so many different things. But my therapist told me one thing that really stuck with me, and it's something that I've shared in especially restitching the tapestry, but also I think in growing up with Godzilla, I shared it a couple of times. My therapist told me that you deserve to exist in the spaces that you inhabit, because the thing that really gets us 90% of the time is like this latent feeling that we don't belong someplace, or like this imposter syndrome. And I think once we're able to step beyond that, and once we're able to celebrate our voice, our presence, our impressions, our representation, that makes it far easier to be upfront. Like I also am aware that like I am pretty vocal in the fandom. Like I am not afraid to call out ridiculousness when I see it. I do acknowledge that there is a right and wrong way to call things out. Like I'm not going to get on the internet and tell somebody that they are a bleepity bleep 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 bleep, right? I'm gonna, as an educator, like my goal is to always open that door, right, and have that conversation. Like if I encounter somebody who is an anti-LGBTQ plus person who's very unaccepting in the fandom, like I don't hate anybody. Like my goal is to never hate somebody, but I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to be like, where does that come from for you? Why do you feel that way? Do you have those people in your life? Right. um I open that door, they choose whether or not they want to walk through it. Case in point, I don't know if Kaiju Kim is still here, but the conversation that she initiated in July, that really gained some degree of virality, and we kept it going. Like that was another example of those instances where we needed to have a very important conversation about something happening in the fandom. It was a very hard conversation to have, but we had that conversation because we saw that it was impacting people that we care about. My philosophy in general is that we should care about everyone in our fandom, right? So when we see something happen to them, why should we not address it, right? I think we owe it to them. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to the community that we love and invest in so much. What harm is it going to do other than bring other chairs to the table and allow others to sit?
That's a really good answer.
Thank you. And I did
Really
not need to rehearse it, surprisingly. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I have to.
You know, one thing that I wanted to talk about from that was the whole what your therapist suggested. Being content with you living in the space that you're in. You know, one thing that oddly enough it was after high, I guess it's not odd, it makes sense. You know, in high school there are factions, there's there's cliques, there's friend groups, there's the hierarchy, the popularity. There is that establishment in typical high school. But after high school, I remember feeling a little more in tone with myself. Like I wasn't, there was nobody to be like, oh, that's the standard. It was suddenly, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do outside of high school? You have to make yourself whoever you want to be. There is no teacher to tell you that's right, that's wrong. There is no, set of school board issued rules and regulations. You have to figure out yourself. And I think that's something that they don't really tell you in high school that I'm really interested in. And I've thought about extensively since high school is just how they like to say that in high school, best years of your life. That's where you learn who you are. That's where you begin your career and become who you are. But for me, it was the succeeding years after high school. That's where I learned a bit more about myself. It maybe not necessarily like I knew where I wanted to go in life. I knew I don't think that really the only thing I've changed since high school is I'm a little less reserved. I'm a little more open to my opinions. I'm a little more open to hearing other opinions. And I'm not afraid to fight for what I believe in and, state my opinion. And that's something that I think has stuck with me is being content with who you are, not worrying about what's going on around you, oh, this person's popular because they play football. Oh, you should play football. And I never really did that. I did play football in high school, but that's because I wanted to. I hated my head coach, so I stopped after a year. But I digress.
There's not a boundary, right?
If I had to choose going to the cinema and watching a movie or going to practice, I was going to go to the cinema. But I'm not going to be a professional football player. Plain and simple.
But had you wanted to be, I have no doubt that you would have succeeded.
I was apparently a good football player. They said that I was pretty good. I am fat, so I did my job.
I was terrible at football. Whenever we had to do it in gym class, I was so tiny in high school. Now, I got some, heft to myself. So I'm sure I could cause some damage if I really needed to.
See, and I'm trying to lose weight. So I'm trying to get back down to middle school, actually. I'm trying to get back to my middle school weight. So I'm 10 pounds off. I have lost 15 pounds since I've started my new routine.
Congratulations. That's exciting. I have this past summer, I got a little bit comfortable with eating a lot. So I could, healthily prioritize my health a bit more. But the new year is still off a ways, so we're good.
That's a whole nother thing that I have been learning a bit more recently. You never stop learning. And
Yeah.
you brought up asking questions, not being afraid to ask questions. One of the things that my first official boss, one of the things he told me, he said a lot of things that I've held on to. But one of my favorite things, one of the many favorite things I have, is he once said, "Be a sponge, ask
Hmm.
questions, take in everything you can from everybody, because the more of a sponge you are, the more you're going to retain, the more you're
Hmm.
going to learn, and the more you're going to be an asset in whatever you're in, because you're taking in that advice, you're learning, you're listening, and you're developing from that."
Yeah. No, I think
And
that's excellent advice.
and so that's something that I've done. Um, but one of the areas that I have not been uh, the best at, from my sleep patterns and my exhaustion, is that health. The health area of being a creative, because you can't sit at a desk all day. That's not
Hmm.
healthy. You can't not eat. Granted, my solution to my dieting is cutting about 90% of the calories I eat out. So I only, like, so there's some days I drink 2 protein shakes and that's all I eat. Um, but outside of today I've been too busy to eat. After this I
Gotcha.
am gonna eat. Um, but it's weird because as I usually will drink water. I might have a little bit of caffeine. I've really toned down the caffeine. I used
Mhm.
to
Yeah,
drink like
me.
800 milligrams a week, which is a lot. Um,
I drink a pot a day.
oh my
Well,
god.
sort of. Maybe half a pot a day.
For me, one of the things. So
Not that that's
it,
a good example to look to anybody. Just FYI.
So full transparency. So back in June, so I work 45 hours my day job. I work for SRS Cinema. That's I try to put in 20 hours there. I do my podcast. It's about an 8-hour process, I say. I study Japanese an hour a day. That's what I try to do, an hour a day. There's of course driving time between home and my studio, home and my job, home and if I'm filming something. I do a lot, sometimes too much. That was my old Twitter bio, and that might be my favorite quote I've ever said is I do a lot, sometimes too much. Um, because one day it was too much. I was at work and I was feeling not okay,
Hmm.
and I was a little shaky, and I felt cold. And I remember I was my boss's boss was there and he was talking to me over our walkie system, and I was fine. Like, it was day-to-day stuff he always asks me, he always talks to me about. But for some reason I suddenly had a sharp pain in my chest, and it like knocked me almost to falling, and I was like, okay. I had those pains before, um but not to this extent. I was like, okay, this is not okay. So I walked over to where I'm usually, like, my base, like where I start my day off and where I end my day. And I was like, I called up my boss. I said, "You need to get here now because
Hmm.
there's about to be a problem. I don't know what's going on." And she showed up, and then like a few seconds go by, and then suddenly, like, I get a really sharp pain, and I get lightheaded, and I fall to the ground. It was pretty embarrassing.
Yeah.
Probably the most embarrassing thing I've been through. Um, but uh, the doctors ended up chopping it up to I had like a slight irregular heartbeat, muscle tension, an anxiety attack, and I had major stress.
Hmm.
Um, and so they did tests. Like, it wasn't a heart attack. I was supposedly fine. Who knows? I never really looked at any of the data. They didn't really tell me a lot. They just said, "You're fine, go home." And so I went home. But the general gist was I was overworking myself. I was stressed out and I had anxiety. And whenever your muscles tense up like that because they've been overworked, mixed with the anxiety, the stress you have, which already makes your body move slower, and then you have that fear of like, okay, what's going on? Why am I hurting right here, which is right next to the heart? That's when the anxiety attack comes in.
Yeah.
And so it was a blend of all of that. Some people say the caffeine was a part of it too. I don't agree with that. They didn't say it was that. I digress.
I'm glad you're okay. Like,
I'm still alive.
no, that's good. That's good. I mean, I think we kind of also view ourselves as indestructible sometimes, as infallible, right? I used to think of myself that way, at least mentally speaking. Full disclosure, everyone, I have bipolar 2. I was diagnosed in 2020, our favorite year, right? But something happened to me that triggered a manic episode. I was not sleeping. I was barely eating. I was hyper creative. I was cleaning the house at 3 a.m. And it became like a spiral, right? And then I went to the doctor and I had a therapy appointment and they deduced this. I was able to get access to medication that helped stabilize me. But it made me realize that I had a cycle of this my entire life when I overtaxed myself, especially. And I think at a certain point when we learn that, we make these adjustments that are necessary to sustaining ourselves, right? And it can be embarrassing. It can cause shame. It can just make you feel like you're human, right? But in those instances, what do? Plop in a Godzilla film and watch it and escape for a while. Because sometimes that's where you need to go. That's where you need to go. To get away from it, to reorient yourself.
And I mean, at the end of the day, that's one of the beauties of this stuff is if you need that escape, you can. For me, it's a little harder because now I watch everything with a bit of an analytical lens. But it is nice to be able to go back to some things and just watch it for the enjoyment of it. That's something that I've unfortunately kind of lost due to my busy schedules. But I've recently had some changes in my day-to-day life that have introduced the concept of not working and spending my time doing other things.
Self-enrichment time. That's what we call it.
And I'm going to be honest, it's going to be something that will be difficult for me to fully grasp for a little while.
And and that's natural. Like, I feel like it makes sense, especially when you are so ingrained in what you do, right? But I think once we get, like, I know, like, I'm a very analytical person too. That's probably why our conversations are always so interesting, because we bounce off from each other that way. But like, there are certain points where I have to be like, all right, Donny, you're gonna turn on this movie and you are just going to enjoy it. You're not going to overanalyze it and then write in an APA annotated 5-page paper. Like, no, you're not going to do that, Donny. You are just going to rot on the couch and enjoy the film. You have to almost like put your foot down with yourself, right?
Yeah.
Or yeah. So first of all, Acno Goji, I am so sorry that happened to you. The anxiety at work. That sounds horrible. Wow. And Kaiju Kim, brain dump journal. Hey, poetry journal. spare journal. I have another journal here, but I can't find it. I have like 5 journals. Like, if you're like me, Elijah, I know you're like me. Whenever you go even to work, you're always thinking of creative stuff to do. But even when you're not in front of your computer or whatever space you're in, create opportunities. I will use my phone and do voice memos. Like, I might think of a poem where I'm like, oh my God, this poem is like, it's kind of a brilliant idea. And I have to voice it out to myself because I may not have something on which to write notes, right? Create opportunities for yourself, right? But when it comes to the enrichment too, create opportunities for that self-enrichment.
That's a good way to look at it. I always there's 3 things I usually try to keep, 4 things I try to keep on me at all times, and that's a pen, my journal, my schedule, and my laptop. And I guess you could throw my phone and wallet in there. But that's what I try to keep on me at all times, because you never know when you will need those. I've had people call me and say, "Hey, I got an idea for a short film." And we'll get on a call for an hour and I'll write notes on it, and by the end of it I've got a story outline for a short film. I like lists. I do to-do lists all the time. That way I can like structure my life. In a world where I have one structured job and everything else has to come second and build a structure from the chaos that is my life on top of other things like curveballs and whatnot.
The millionth time I'm going to do shameless self-promotion. My show, Restitching the Tapestry, my other podcast that I do, we talk about this a lot, like life balance stuff. For me, I do to-do lists still, but I found that they were creating too much pressure. So I switched to accomplishment lists instead. So like, instead of like creating like this lengthy list of like, oh God, like what am I not getting done? I'm writing down when I do get things done. And I realize that it's adding up. And then it gives me that serotonin that I need to stave away bipolar manic episodes. And it works. It works for me. It may not work for everyone.
But that's actually a really smart idea. I get a lot of pleasure of like going to those lists afterwards and doing check. I love doing little check marks when I've done something. I got it done. Boom, it's done, and then I can look at
good
that.
To write a check, doesn't it?
It's really nice. It's one line with 2 motions, and it does wonders for you. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, one thing that we can say is, being a creative, whatever level, if you're Stephen King or you're Joe who lives with his parents who's 13 and he's, drawing pictures or writing fan fiction or whatever the case may be, the life of somebody who is creative is rocky, but there are a ton of benefits from that. And I would venture as far to say being creative lets you learn more about not only yourself, but the world around you. And personally, I think it provides interesting context to what is going on. I study a lot of Japanese stuff. That is a whole nother culture that I'm learning about that I love. It makes you realize that there's more to this world than what you know.
Yes,
and
I think that could be why we fall in love with Godzilla too. Like it's an eye view into another world entirely, another culture, another crucial swath of historical context.
That's a good point. And that's something that I think maybe not everyone enjoys, but I think a lot of people do enjoy having that ability to almost see the world differently. I think
Yeah.
it's a really beneficial thing. And one thing that I appreciate about these conversations is it does open you up to a different person and their perspective and what they go on and what they do.
Mhm.
And I think we've had a pretty good conversation here about that. You've been able to promote yourself quite well, and I'm very happy. I'm very happy. Every time you said that, I got a smile on my face, because you know what? That's one of the
Uh,
beautiful things about doing these shows with people who isn't
mhm.
Rex and I. It's because then other people can be on here, they can promote their stuff, they can talk about their stuff, and
That's exactly why I do
another
Growing Up
world.
with Godzilla. Yeah.
And so, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that's exactly why I do Growing Up with Godzilla. Like it gives people those opportunities. And that's one of the big obstacles as creators that we face, right? In many of our outlets, we have to do our own self-promotion to get our stuff out there. And that can be very hard to do.
It can be. And that's why, before we wrap things up here, because it is getting late, I want you, Donnie, to be able to promote anything you want. If you want to promote stuff you've already promoted, do it again. Take as much time as you want to promote anything and everything.
Well, if you would like to check out my books, you can visit my Linktree, linktree.com/DonnyWinter. You can visit my website, DonnyWinter.com. And if you would like to watch my show, Growing Up with Godzilla, you can find that on YouTube or your other favorite streaming services. We are nearing the end of season 3, which is hard to believe, but we're almost there. Season 4 is already in the works, planning it. And I'm just really happy with how people have been just excited to consume more of that show. So thank you all for the support, and stay tuned for what's to come.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Donnie. I know that it was a little hectic at the beginning, but this has been a really good conversation that I think I don't know if anybody else learned anything, but I learned a couple things, and that's good in my book.
Thank you for that. Thank you for allowing me into your space. Thank you for carving out the time. Thank you for doing all that you do, both here as a filmmaker, commentator, all that you do with Kaiju United, what you did with Kaiju Ramen, all of that stuff matters. And I hope that you see and celebrate that.
Thank you. I do my best. So thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who was in the chat commenting. I really appreciated all the people talking about their experiences, talking about what they've done. It's really appreciated. I love seeing comments. I know sometimes we get to those a little late because we get into a rabbit hole, but we were able to cover, I think, most of them. So thank you all for being able to tune in, first of all, live, and second of all, being able to interact and talk with us and help steer the conversation in fun and interesting courses. So I think one of the best ways to end this off is what Kim says here: the real Godzilla is the friends we made along the way.
Twin. Mwah.
And with that, I think we're going to wrap things up here. So thank you again, Donnie. A lot of fun. Thank you to everybody who was in the chat. It was a lot of fun. And I can't wait to see what happens next month with episode 20 of Kaiju Conversation Live. 20 episodes. I've done this for 20 months. It's crazy.
Woo!
So with that, we're going to wrap up this Tuesday evening. I'm not. I got plenty of work to do, but we're going to wrap it up here. So thank you all for tuning in. For anybody who's on the VOD, thank you for listening all the way through. We appreciate all the support you give to not only Kaiju Conversation, but everybody that's involved, everybody that interacts, and everybody who is in some way, shape, or form connected to Kaiju Conversation. We're not just two people. There's a huge amount of people who have been on here who have done their fair share of helping make this show, and myself, who I am today. So thank you all so much. And with that, I think I'm going to stop talking. So
Adieu. Fare thee well.
thank you all so much. And as always, please remember, life's too short to not talk big. Bye, guys.
Bye.